Bernadette Gonzalez was a talented school nurse, a beautiful, strong, and confident woman. Her life seemed perfect when she met Juan Perusquia, a charming former congressman. From the very first encounter, there was an intense connection between them. 6 months later, they got married, becoming a couple that appeared to have a blissful life. But then, on a fateful night, that sweet happiness ended in tragedy. Juan collapsed in a pool of blood, while Bernadette stood there, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with panic. She claimed it was self-defense, but as evidence gradually emerged, a darker truth began to unfold. On May 14, 2003, in Laredo, Texas, 5:51 p.m., the 911 emergency center received a frantic call. On the other end, a woman's voice was trembling yet urgent. "I need an ambulance. My husband. I need help." The caller was Bernadette Perusquia, 31 years old. Her voice was mixed with rapid, panicked breaths. She told the dispatcher that her husband, Juan Perusquia, 26 years old, was gravely injured after an argument. "He charged at me. I had no other choice." Her voice broke into sobs. According to Bernadette, she had only tried to defend herself. But no matter how she justified it, the truth remained her husband was dying. She didn't dare get close, didn't have the courage to check if he was still alive. But then her instincts as a nurse took over. Bernadette forced herself forward, trembling as she examined Juan. The wound was too deep. She tried to stop the bleeding, to keep him conscious. When the sound of sirens echoed outside the door, hope was still there, but it might have been too late. As paramedics took Juan away, Bernadette couldn't go with him. She had something more important to do: answer the police's questions. Born in 1972 in Laredo, South Texas, Bernadette Gonzalez grew up in a small town but harbored great ambitions. She was always known as intelligent, friendly, and driven. During her school years, Bernadette excelled academically and yearned for greater opportunities. In the late 1990s, she received a prestigious scholarship to St. Anna University. But after just 1 year away from home, the longing for her family became too overwhelming. Bernadette decided to return to Laredo and continue her education closer to home. She enrolled in a community college, and by the age of 21, she officially became a licensed nurse. However, the long and grueling hospital shifts quickly exhausted her. In 1994, she took a different path, accepting a job as a school nurse at a middle school in Laredo, a less stressful job that still allowed her to help others. In 1998, a brief relationship with a colleague resulted in Bernadette becoming pregnant. Despite the challenges of being a single mother, she didn't falter. Shortly after giving birth, she married a supportive man, but that marriage lasted less than 2 years. In 2000, they divorced amicably, leaving Bernadette to raise her child alone. After her failed marriage, Bernadette poured all her energy into self-improvement. She delved into martial arts, earning a black belt in karate and ranking high in several competitions. She also attended a handgun training course at a local shooting range, not just for recreation, but to protect herself. 2 years after her divorce, Bernadette had transformed into a strong, independent woman, and soon she started drawing attention. Beautiful, confident, and full of charisma, she became admired by many. One of the men drawn to her was Juan Perusquia, a school security officer. Juan Perusquia was 4 years younger than Bernadette. He had just returned to his hometown of Laredo after serving in the United States Army as a military police officer. But he did not return alone. He also brought a bride. However, their whirlwind marriage quickly fell apart shortly after returning to the U.S. People always spoke of Juan as a sweet, kind, somewhat easygoing, and down-to-earth man. But in January 2002, he set his sights on a greater challenge, winning the heart of the school's new nurse, Bernadette Gonzalez. With his bright smile and natural charm, Juan gradually broke through Bernadette's tough exterior. Behind that strong facade, he saw a woman who was much softer, more gentle, and far more captivating. Months of patient pursuit, playful teasing, and affectionate moments brought them closer. And finally, they started dating. But just a few weeks into their relationship, Bernadette found out she was unexpectedly pregnant. She panicked. She knew all too well how difficult it was to raise a child alone because she had been through it before. But Juan did not waver. He reassured her, promising a bright future. However, he was not yet officially divorced from his ex-wife. It was not until December that everything was settled. As the due date approached, the two decided to get married and build a real home together. In February 2003, their son was born, further strengthening the bond between Bernadette and Juan. That was also when Juan seriously started thinking about the future. He decided to leave his job as a school security officer and pursue a new career, becoming a USBORDER patrol agent. Bernadette had never felt like life had so much promise. A new husband, a complete family, a stable future. But then, just days after Juan passed the Border Patrol entrance exam, everything fell apart in a way no one could have expected. May 14, 2003, 5:50 p.m., Laredo, Texas. Bernadette Perusquia dialed 911 with trembling hands. Her voice was urgent, breaking between rapid breaths. "My husband, Juan Perusquia, he's been shot. Please, send an ambulance immediately." But immediately after, she made a chilling admission. Their argument had turned violent. She had no other choice. She had to pull the trigger. When the police arrived, they found Juan lying motionless in the hallway, blood spreading across the wooden floor. But he was still alive. Bernadette, driven by her instincts as a nurse, was desperately trying to stop the bleeding, trying to keep him with her. But there was something uncertain in her eyes. She did not know how much longer he could hold on. The paramedics quickly lifted Juan onto a stretcher and transferred him into the ambulance. On the way, he struggled to speak. His voice weak but clear. "My wife, she shot me." A paramedic reassured him, telling him that Bernadette had already admitted to her actions. But Juan shook his head, his eyes clouded with pain. "She shot me because I was leaving." Before he could say anything more, he slipped into unconsciousness. Were Juan's words merely the confused mutterings of a wounded man, or was there a darker truth behind Bernadette's claim of self-defense? After being examined by paramedics, Bernadette was asked by the police to come to the station for questioning. She did not resist. She was ready to tell her story, and in about 4 pages she wrote it all down. Bernadette did not deny what Juan had said. She admitted that they had argued, and not just this time. According to her, their fights had become frequent in recent months. Juan was obsessed with the idea that she was seeing another man. But no matter what, they always tried to mend things. They had only been married for less than 6 months, and just 3 months ago, they had welcomed their first son. However, on that fateful day, when Bernadette returned home from work, she found something in the bedroom that made everything collapse. Juan was packing his belongings. Bernadette froze. He was about to leave. She was not ready to be abandoned, not ready to face life as a single mother again. She tried to persuade him to stay. But instead of listening, Juan became furious. The argument quickly escalated. In a fit of anger, Juan pushed Bernadette onto the bed. She got up, grabbed her phone, intending to call 911, but instead of doing that, she called her mother-in-law. She handed the phone to Juan. As he stepped into another room to talk, Bernadette did not hesitate any longer. She walked straight to the bed, pulled out a handgun, and hid it under the mattress. When Juan returned, he seemed calmer after speaking with his mother. But after being attacked, Bernadette no longer believed that everything was truly over. She made a decision. If Juan really wanted to leave, she would let him go. Bernadette told the police that before Juan left, she made one final request: leave the wedding ring behind. Juan did not argue. He took off the ring and handed it to her. But as he stepped out of the bedroom, his anger flared up once again. In a sudden outburst, he punched the bookshelf, causing it to collapse. This time, Juan had crossed the line. Bernadette no longer felt safe. She pulled a pistol from her waistband and aimed it directly at her husband. But instead of fear or retreat, Juan only became more enraged. And then he lunged at her. In a split second, Bernadette's finger tightened on the trigger. A deafening gunshot rang out. Juan collapsed onto the floor. Just one bullet, but enough to bring a man down. Bernadette claimed she had acted in self-defense. And then, paradoxically, the very woman who had just pulled the trigger tried desperately to save her husband's life. She used her nursing skills to stop the bleeding, to keep him conscious, waiting for the paramedics to arrive. But the most crucial question remained. Would her efforts be enough to keep him alive? And if he woke up, what would he say? May 14, 2003, the Laredo, Texas police interrogated Bernadette Perusquia, a 31-year-old woman. She did not hide the truth about who had pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, Juan lay unconscious in a local hospital, and Bernadette's testimony was all the police had to continue their investigation. Upon closer examination, the police confirmed that Juan had indeed left after 6 months of marriage, as evidenced by all his belongings being packed into his car. However, when analyzing the crime scene, the police noticed an inconsistency. They photographed the gun and examined the location of the shell casing. Bernadette claimed she had shot her husband at close range, but the distance between the shell casing and where Juan collapsed was up to 18 feet. If the shot was not fired at close range, as she stated, was her use of deadly force justified? Investigators did not think so. The location of the shell casing and Juan's fall contradicted Bernadette's account. The police examined her immediately after the shooting but found no signs of injury to support her claim that Juan had attacked her first. No bruises, no scratches, no evidence that she had been assaulted. Faced with this contradiction, detectives decided to expand the investigation. When interviewing Juan's family and friends, they heard a very different story. According to them, Bernadette was always the one controlling the finances in the household, and after getting married, she gradually took control of Juan's life where he went, who he spoke to. Juan's friends insisted that he was afraid of his wife and was unlikely to have been the first aggressor. On the contrary, they suspected Bernadette was the one who pulled the trigger in a fit of rage. Combined with the physical evidence that did not align with Bernadette's statement, detectives had reason to believe that this shooting was not as she claimed. At 1:00 a.m. on May 15, 2003, nearly 7 hours after the confrontation with Bernadette, Juan Perusquia took his last breath. The news of his death left his family and friends in shock and grief. Juan's death completely changed the nature of the case. What had initially been an assault now became a murder. The case was transferred to the Homicide Division, and with the discrepancies between Bernadette's testimony and the physical evidence at the scene, police believed they had enough to charge her. Just hours later, the Laredo authorities issued an arrest warrant for Bernadette Perusquia on first-degree murder charges. In September 2006, Bernadette Perusquia's trial officially began. The 33-year-old mother of two stood before the court, facing a first-degree murder charge. From the moment Bernadette called 911 on that fateful afternoon, the central question of the case had always been, was it self-defense or a premeditated killing? Bernadette insisted that she fired the gun to protect herself, but the prosecution presented a different theory. When Juan decided to leave, Bernadette pulled a gun on him. When he refused to comply, she pulled the trigger. The most critical piece of evidence against Bernadette was the distance between the shell casing and where Juan collapsed, nearly 18 feet apart. If Bernadette had fired at close range, as she claimed, why was the shell casing so far away? The inconsistency in her statement led the prosecution to argue that this was not a legitimate case of self-defense. But when the defense began presenting its case, they stunned the courtroom with a completely different narrative. According to Bernadette, she was a victim of domestic abuse. She described her 6-month marriage to Juan as a living hell. She specifically recalled an incident where Juan had kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant, a memory she had buried to protect her husband's career. The prosecution quickly countered. Juan's friends and family vehemently denied these allegations of abuse. They believed Bernadette was trying to paint a distorted picture to justify her actions. But would the jury be convinced by her testimony? Laredo, Texas courtroom, a breathless afternoon. Bernadette Perusquia sat motionless, hands clenched tightly together, her tense gaze fixed on the jury's every movement. The atmosphere in the room was so heavy that even a single deep breath could shatter the silence. After months of litigation, everything now came down to a single verdict. The jury returned after just 3 hours of deliberation, a terrifyingly short amount of time. The four persons stood up, their voice firm but cold. "We find the defendant guilty." Murmurs spread across the room, then quickly faded into stunned silence. Bernadette froze, her face turning pale. She blinked repeatedly, as if hoping this was just a nightmare. But no, this nightmare was real. The sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. On the other side of the courtroom, Juan's family clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces, but these were tears of justice. Finally, justice had been served. They had endured enough. Their son, a husband, a father, a friend, had been murdered and smeared as an abuser. But today, the truth had prevailed. Bernadette lowered her head, her eyes vacant, as the officers approached to handcuff her. The courtroom doors closed, sealing the final chapter of a tragedy, a love that once burned bright, now ending in the shadows of betrayal and loss. Ruby in Ruffalo, a sharp mind, she almost achieved straight A's in law school. Her husband, John, was no less intelligent, but tragedy struck when he mysteriously died. John's death sparked an investigation filled with shocking accusations, and chilling secrets gradually came to light. It was as if a voice from beyond was guiding the truth into the light. Can a dead man speak? Or is someone playing a dangerous game? Amid the grief of widowhood and the whirlwind of legal battles, Ruby was forced to fight, not only to seek justice for her husband, but also to protect her own freedom. Langford, British Columbia, October 25, 2003. After a week of relentless rain, a hiker followed a trail in Mount Wells Regional Park, on the outskirts of Victoria. The narrow path ran parallel to an old, abandoned drainage pipe. As he stepped down near the pipe, he suddenly froze. Something looked strange. Emerging from the darkness of the pipe, something sent a chill down his spine. A hand. His heart pounding. The hiker realized he had just stumbled upon a corpse. Without hesitation, he immediately called 911. Within minutes, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the scene. The body of a white male, in his mid-30s, was discovered in the West Shore area of Langford. No identification, no visible wounds. He hadn't been stabbed. He hadn't been shot. But what had killed him? The victim's identity was quickly confirmed. John Ruffalo, 36 years old, who had been reported missing 5 days earlier by none other than his wife, Ruby. Ruby Anjuba was born in 1956 in a remote community in Terrace, British Columbia. From a young age, she showed intelligence and promise, enrolling at the University of Victoria. However, upon arriving in Victoria, a familiar pattern began to emerge in her life. Ruby dropped out, got married, quickly divorced, and then fell into a new relationship. Unfortunately, both relationships were fraught with abuse. Each romance left her with a child, and by the age of 30, Ruby was struggling to raise 4 children on her own. Life became increasingly difficult, and in 1986 she decided to return to her family's farm in Terrace. But 2 years later, in 1988, she left once again, this time returning to Victoria without her children. Back in the city, Ruby was determined to change her life. She went back to school, completed her degree, and it was there that she met John Ruffalo, a man 11 years younger than her. Despite the age gap, they quickly formed a bond. John was outgoing, charismatic, and passionate, while Ruby was drawn to his warmth and devotion. In April 1990, they got married. Ruby's children from previous relationships remained with their family, while she and John built a new home together, welcoming a daughter. Although Ruby had a university degree and John did not, she chose to stay home to care for their child while John became the family's breadwinner, working hard to support them. As Ruby continued to pursue her education, John became increasingly involved in real estate. However, studying law was never easy, and life wasn't always smooth. In 1998, shortly after Ruby graduated from law school, John suddenly faced charges for violating the Real Estate Act of British Columbia. Once again, turmoil struck, presenting new challenges for their marriage. John eventually broke the law and was convicted of 22 offenses. However, instead of serving prison time, he was only fined $14,000 and forced to give up his job as a prison guard. Meanwhile, Ruby's career was also struggling. Despite graduating from law school, she found herself unemployed, unable to secure a foothold in the industry. Marital tensions escalated. The relationship between Ruby and John became so distant that they no longer even shared the same bed. Long work days and the pressures of life made the household atmosphere suffocating. Even their 12-year-old daughter, Giovanna, could sense the growing rift between her parents. That summer, John seemed increasingly detached from his family. One night, he bluntly asked his daughter, "Do you want me to leave?" Giovanna, though still a child, understood that her parents' marriage was on the verge of collapse. Yet John promised her that he wouldn't go. But that promise didn't last long. Not long after, John mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind unanswered questions. On the evening of October 19, 2003, just before 11:00 p.m., the shift manager at Brink Security called Ruby Ann Ruffalo. His voice was tense as he asked, "Where's John? He didn't show up for work." Ruby was confused. She didn't know where John was. Over the phone, her bewilderment was as evident as the manager's concern. But the real worry began the next morning when John still hadn't returned home. Ruby started feeling uneasy. She turned to Vivian Kirkland, a close friend who lived in the basement apartment of her house. The two women quickly went to the police station to report John missing, but the police remained unfazed. They told Ruby not to worry because John had been missing for less than 24 hours. "Maybe he just got drunk somewhere and will be home soon," they reassured her. However, the day passed with no sign of John. By evening, when the 24-hour mark since his disappearance was reached, his family and friends were genuinely alarmed. John's phone rang nonstop. Messages flooded in. Ruby seemed to be spiraling into panic. One of her tenants recalled that she paced back and forth incessantly, so anxious she was nearly frantic. By October 22, 2 days after John was reported missing, his family began to believe that something terrible had happened. That afternoon, John's brother-in-law was refueling at a local gas station when he suddenly recognized a familiar-looking car. As he moved closer to inspect it, he confirmed it was John's car. But John was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, his brother-in-law immediately called the police. When officers searched the vehicle, they found a suspicious detail. John's wallet was still inside, along with his identification. This raised a series of questions. Why would John abandon both his car and wallet? Where had he gone? And most importantly, what had really happened to him? The police immediately tried to contact Ruby to inform her of the discovery and to ask more about John. Strangely, it took them until the next day to reach her. Shortly afterward, the police received a call from Ruby's lawyer. He said that Ruby wanted to meet with them and was willing to assist in the investigation. When Ruby arrived at the police station, she wasn't alone. Beside her was Vivian Kirkland, her loyal friend. During the interview, Ruby explained that Vivian was there for emotional support, while her lawyer accompanied her to ensure everything proceeded properly. When asked about her husband's disappearance, Ruby admitted that it was highly unusual. "John would usually call me or leave a message," she said. But then she followed with an even more shocking claim. John might have been involved in a dark secret. According to Ruby, John had a habit of using drugs. She had even left him briefly because of it, but they eventually reconciled. However, she never fully trusted him. And just days before John went missing, Ruby claimed she had found evidence to support her suspicions. While cleaning the house, she discovered that John had hidden a large sum of cash, $7, taped to the back of a cabinet. But when the police searched Ruby and John's home, they found no trace of the cash she had mentioned. The $7 had vanished, and so had John. Was this merely a coincidence? Or did John have a real reason to hide the money? Were drug dealers hunting him down? A new theory began to emerge. Perhaps John was on the run due to debts owed to drug traffickers. But to the police, this scenario seemed unconvincing. John's family didn't believe it either. As investigators continued to track and verify Ruby's statements, they noticed a major issue. There was no evidence to suggest that John was a drug addict. A heavy user couldn't possibly manage 3 jobs at once. It was almost impossible. John's sister outright rejected this theory. There's no way he would just leave, she insisted, worry etched across her face. And as each day passed without any sign of John, his family began to fear the worst. Saturday, October 25, 6 days after John's disappearance, a hiker descending from Mount Wells Regional Park stumbled upon a horrifying sight: the body of a man inside an old drainage culvert. Panicked, he immediately called 911. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly arrived at the scene, calling in a crime scene analyst to assist with the situation. As investigators pulled the body from the culvert, they compared it to a photo in the missing persons file. The results confirmed the family's worst fears. The deceased man was John Ruffalo. The grief of losing him was already devastating, but the way he was found left his family even more haunted. What had killed him? At first glance, the body showed no signs of beating or obvious violence. Hoping to find answers, investigators hiked up the mountain to what was believed to be the entrance of the culvert. There, they discovered discarded drug paraphernalia. This evidence seemed to align with Ruby's claim that John was a drug user. But was it really true? Had John overdosed and died tragically? The police weren't entirely convinced. Something felt off. Drug addicts didn't typically wander into the woods to inject themselves. And if John had truly been an addict, why did none of his family and friends believe it? On the night of October 26, 2003, officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police knocked on the door of Ruby Ann Ruffalo's home in the suburbs of Victoria. Just a day earlier, a hiker had discovered the body of her missing husband, John Ruffalo. He was only 36 years old. Ruby had reported John missing 6 days prior. Just 2 days before his body was found, she had told investigators that John was a drug addict, possibly in debt, and even suggested that he might have taken his own life due to the pressures of drugs and money. At first glance, John's death seemed to align with Ruby's statement. But was that really the case? While John's family and friends mourned his loss, investigators began asking questions. An initial theory suggested that John might have taken his own life with drugs. But there was a major problem. Many details didn't add up. If John had truly walked up the mountain to inject himself, why was his car found abandoned more than 8 miles away? And if John hadn't gone there himself, then who had taken his body up the mountain? The next question, who had done it? On October 28, 2003, an unexpected witness came forward, providing police with a shocking statement. This witness was Robert Johnson, a man struggling with alcoholism. He claimed that Ruby Ann Ruffalo, along with her close friend Vivian Kirkland, had approached him and offered him an $8 bottle of sherry, a cheap bribe, but one tempting enough for someone like Johnson. But the most shocking part was Ruby's request. She wanted him to do a special job, a gruesome task, to kill John Ruffalo. Johnson recounted that he had immediately refused. However, Ruby didn't give up. She listened to Johnson's suggestion for a more discreet method of murder, a hot shot, a lethal overdose of heroin, ensuring the victim's death without leaving any trace of foul play. This statement could not be taken lightly. Police recalled what Ruby had previously claimed, that John was a drug addict. They had also found drug paraphernalia near where John's body had been discovered. Everything was starting to connect into a suspicious plot. But Johnson's story wasn't over. He went on to reveal that on the night of October 19, the night John disappeared, Ruby had contacted him again. When Johnson arrived at her house, he was shocked to see Ruby and Vivian Kirkland standing in the driveway with John's lifeless body. Ruby had offered him more alcohol in exchange for his help disposing of the corpse. But once again, Johnson refused. He walked away, leaving Ruby and Vivian standing there with a dead body and a dark secret. If Johnson's story was true, this was a premeditated murder. But what puzzled the police was the motive. If Ruby truly wanted her husband dead, why had she only offered Johnson a cheap bottle of wine? And for someone with a law degree like Ruby, why would she attempt to recruit a homeless alcoholic to carry out her plan? As police were still considering the credibility of Robert Johnson's testimony, two more unexpected witnesses came forward, making the case even more disturbing. This time, it was Jonathan Horton, an 18-year-old, and his mother, Linda, a former tenant of the Ruffalo family. Linda revealed a shocking truth. More than a year and a half before John's disappearance, Ruby Ann Ruffalo had approached her son and offered him money to kill her husband. Jonathan told the police that he had immediately refused. But instead of letting it go, Jonathan's mother, Linda, confronted Ruby directly. Ruby's reaction? Not a single denial. In fact, according to Linda, Ruby even repeated the offer to her, offering to pay her to kill John Ruffalo. And once again, the offer was rejected. This revelation raised a puzzling question. If John knew that his wife had plotted to kill him, why did he continue living with her for another year and a half? Any ordinary person who discovered their spouse wanted them dead would immediately go to the police or leave. But John didn't. The reason might lie in another secret one that John's mother revealed to the police. John Ruffalo had been having an affair, and he was planning to file for divorce. Toxicology results seemed to confirm Robert Johnson's account of a hot shot, a lethal dose of heroin strong enough to kill instantly. But there was an even more crucial detail. Although Ruby had claimed John was a drug addict, there were no signs of chronic drug use. Only a single needle mark was found on John's arm. This suggested that the fatal heroin dose could have been his first and only injection, one that someone else had administered. Not only that, but heroin wasn't the only substance found in John's body. Tests also detected amitriptyline, a drug that can cause paralysis and render a victim defenseless. Could Ruby have mixed the drug into John's food or drink, knocking him unconscious before injecting him with heroin? The only problem was, how could police prove it? On March 3, 2004, the investigation into John Ruffalo's mysterious death took a critical turn. Police searched Ruby's home, including the basement apartment of Vivian Kirkland, her close friend and a potential accomplice. There they found a prescription and a bottle of amitriptyline in Vivian's room. A chilling coincidence. This was the exact drug found in John Ruffalo's body during the autopsy. On March 4, 2004, Canadian police returned to Ruby Ruffalo's home. This time, they weren't just there to gather more evidence, they were there to arrest both Ruby and Vivian Kirkland. Ruby Ruffalo, the prime suspect, was completely stunned as the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She didn't utter a word, but the shock was evident on her face. Soon after, both women were taken to the police station. As the interrogation room door closed, Ruby remained eerily composed. She refused to make any statements and immediately requested a lawyer, a classic move for someone well-versed in the law. But Vivian Kirkland was different. Held in the interrogation room next door, Ruby's closest friend became the center of the investigation. Detectives were determined to uncover her true role in John Ruffalo's death. At first, Vivian tried to deny any involvement, but how long could she stay silent when the evidence against her kept piling up? On March 3, 2009, nearly 6 years after John Ruffalo's body was found in the woods outside Victoria, British Columbia, and almost 5 years after Ruby Ruffalo's arrest, she finally stood trial for her husband's murder. John's family had waited far too long for justice, and what angered them most was that Ruby had spent nearly 5 years out on bail, free as if nothing had happened. With a law degree from one of Canada's top universities, Ruby knew the legal system inside and out, and perhaps she had used that knowledge to delay the case, hoping it would fade into obscurity. But Judgment Day had come. That morning in court, the prosecutor opened the trial with a statement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Ruby Ruffalo had killed her husband because he was leaving her. But this was not just a crime of passion. John had planned to divorce her, and that meant dividing assets, a prospect Ruby could not accept. To her, everything they owned, from real estate investments to every dollar in their bank accounts, belonged to her, not to John. And when she realized she might lose it all, Ruby took action. But the prosecutor had more than just a theory. They had a crucial witness, someone who had once been Ruby's most loyal accomplice, Vivian Kirkland. After years of protecting Ruby, standing by her side like a shadow, Vivian finally broke under the weight of the investigation. She testified, exposing the entire murder plot that Ruby had orchestrated. With overwhelming evidence, on November 18, 2010, the judge delivered the final verdict. Ruby Ruffalo was guilty of first-degree murder. Her sentence, life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. After nearly 8 years of uncertainty, pain, and despair, John's family could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Justice had been served. The man they loved, a husband, a son, a brother, had not died in silence. Though nothing could ever replace their loss, at least they knew that the perpetrator had been rightfully punished. Letitia Jandreau, a bodybuilder with an impressive physique, a successful husband, and then he vanished without a trace. Paul's BMW 5 Series remained parked in the garage, covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't been used for days. But the growing sense of unease intensified as strange details began to emerge. Why was Christmas wrapping paper taped over the windows in the middle of summer? Why didn't Letitia want to talk about her husband's disappearance? Why was there a strong, persistent odor of decomposition in the house? And who or what was hiding in the closet? The mysteries surrounding Letitia continued to pile up. What was she hiding? And more importantly, where was Paul Jandreau, Moyock, North Carolina, June 30, 2010? It was supposed to be just an ordinary Wednesday morning. But for Safety Inspector Dennis Carter, that day was anything but normal. For the first time in nearly 2 years, his colleague Paul Jandreau did not show up for work. Paul was always punctual. He had never missed a day. But that morning his phone went unanswered, and his messages were ignored. A sense of unease grew among Carter and his co-workers. They decided to report the matter to the authorities. The next morning, a deputy sheriff was dispatched to Jandreau's home for a welfare check. Upon arrival, she found Paul's truck parked outside, but there was no sign of him. She knocked on the door, called his name, but the house remained eerily silent. Concern deepened when Paul's colleagues suggested calling his wife, Letitia Jandreau, an employee at a defense contracting firm. However, when the police contacted Letitia at Blackwater, she simply stated that she hadn't seen her husband that day and had no idea where he was. Things took an even stranger turn when, shortly after that phone call, Letitia, the 37-year-old wife, also vanished without a trace. A husband and wife disappearing within the same time frame, no clues, no explanations. Although she was once an outstanding high school athlete, Letitia Jandreau never attended college. The former track and field star had gone through 2 failed marriages before meeting Paul Jandreau in the summer of 2002. At the time, Paul, 42 years old, was preparing to leave the Navy after more than 20 years of service. He retired with the rank of commander and quickly started a new career at a defense contracting firm in Norfolk. But Paul was not a typical retiree. With his extensive experience, he adapted easily to his new life. The first time he met Letitia, he was immediately drawn to her. At 29, she had a toned, muscular physique and an energetic presence. In fact, Letitia was even stronger than Paul. They quickly became workout partners, and within weeks, their relationship evolved beyond just training together. Less than a year later, on June 28, 2003, Letitia and Paul officially married, marking the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. Letitia always exuded toughness, while Paul was friendly and approachable. When meeting Letitia for the first time, she barely interacted with anyone, reserved, distant. In contrast, Paul was cheerful and easygoing. Despite their contrasting personalities, they stayed together. Paul had a stable income at Bay, and Letitia also transitioned into the defense industry, joining a private training facility operated by Blackwater USA, one of the largest military contractors in the country. Their life seemed to be going smoothly, stable careers, a promising future. But then, tragedy struck, one that would test their marriage in ways no one could have foreseen. In 2006, after a long struggle with infertility, Paul and Letitia finally received good news. But their happiness was quickly overshadowed by tragedy. In July, Letitia went into premature labor. The twins could not be born healthy. One baby did not survive before birth, and the other lived for only 42 seconds.
The immense pain devastated Letitia.
She fell into deep despair and developed post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from the loss of her children. To cope with the grief, Letitia threw herself into training, doubling her hours at the gym. She immersed herself in female bodybuilding competitions and won, channeling her pain into a relentless drive to push herself beyond her limits.
Paul was proud of his wife's achievements.
He kept photos from Letitia's competitions and even built a home gym in their Moyoc house to support her training.
He did everything he could to encourage and motivate her, but instead of bringing them closer, the distance between them grew. Paul's friends began to notice something. He was no longer Letitia's husband. He was becoming her trainer. By 2008, 2 years after the tragic loss of their twins, Letitia had become so independent that she was emotionally distant from her own husband. They rarely spent time together, like two ships silently passing in the night. Paul slept in an upstairs bedroom while Letitia spent her nights downstairs.
They lived under the same roof, but in reality, they were completely separated. She had her own life.
So did he. Paul grew increasingly frustrated with the arrangement. After nearly 8 years together, he had endured enough. Perhaps he wanted to leave.
Perhaps he was ready to move on. But the question was, would he ever get the chance? Because just days later, Paul vanished, and Letitia began acting strangely. There was Christmas wrapping paper taped over the windows despite it being July.
She refused to talk about her husband's disappearance, and a putrid smell of decomposition began creeping through the house.
Even so, she agreed to take time off work and return home to meet with the police. When Letitia arrived at the house, she and the female deputy entered together. The house was a mess. There was no sign of Paul. From the moment his disappearance was reported, Paul's colleagues and neighbors felt that something was wrong.
2 of his co-workers decided to drive to his house to check on him. As they pulled into the driveway, a bizarre sight unfolded before them. All the windows were covered with Christmas wrapping paper in the middle of summer. Inside, they found Letitia standing in the dark. The lights were off. Every window was sealed shut.
But the strangeness didn't end there. Letitia was wearing a cloak, pulled up to cover most of her face.
Dennis, one of Paul's co-workers, stared at her and asked bluntly, "Have you seen Paul?"
"Yes," Letitia replied, but Dennis didn't believe her. He met her gaze, his eyes sharp.
"I don't believe you."
The accusation made Letitia furious. The atmosphere became unbearably tense. The Christmas wrapping paper on the windows, Letitia's reaction.
The vague accusations about Paul. Everything felt terribly, horribly wrong.
Dennis and his colleague quickly left the Jandro home. And as soon as they stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind them. However, Dennis didn't go straight home. His instincts told him something wasn't right.
So he spent time talking to Paul's neighbors, hoping to uncover some clue.
The next day, on July Honest, Paul's co-worker, Kyle Cheatwood, along with another employee from Bay Systems, decided to drive down to his house for another check. When they arrived, Paul's truck was still parked out front, but what caught their attention was the person unloading items from the truck. It wasn't Paul. It was Letitia. What was she doing with her husband's truck? And why did her every action radiate an air of secrecy?
Kyle immediately contacted the authorities. When the police arrived, Letitia seemed irritated. She claimed she was just cleaning up. When asked about the furniture, she gave a curt response, "There's nothing."
She even allowed the detectives to check the trunk of her car, as if she wanted to prove she wasn't hiding anything. But soon after, her demeanor shifted, agitated, snappy, snapping at anyone who mentioned Paul. Once again, authorities found no trace of Paul, no evidence of a struggle, nothing suspicious. But there was one thing they knew for sure: Paul hadn't simply run off with another woman. The investigation team decided to call Paul's cell phone, hoping it would lead them closer to the truth. And then a crucial signal appeared. Paul's phone was still on, and it was pinging off cell towers in Elizabeth City.
The search for Paul Jandro grew more intense. As soon as investigators detected a trace of his presence, they immediately drove to Elizabeth City,
scouring every hotel in hopes of finding a lead. Had Paul simply grown tired of his marriage and left for a few days? Or was something far more sinister at play?
Armed with a copy of Paul's driver's license photo, they approached hotel staff one by one,
asking if anyone had seen him. Some employees vaguely recalled seeing a white man in his 50s who resembled Paul. When they arrived at the Hampton Inn, they found key witnesses. Several staff members confirmed they had seen Paul the previous night. They were so close to the missing man, or at least they thought they were. Paul's co-workers continued to call his phone, but there was no answer. Then, more than 24 hours after he had vanished, the phone was finally picked up. But it wasn't Paul on the other end. Instead, the voice of a construction worker came through. He said he had found the phone in perfect condition, undamaged, almost as if someone had deliberately placed it there. That same day, Letitia unexpectedly reached out to investigators. But she wasn't calling to ask about her husband. She had only one question: did the police come to my house today? Authorities arranged to meet with Letitia later that day. But when they arrived at the scheduled time, she was gone. On the door of her house, they found only a small note that read, "I went out for a walk." They searched everywhere, but Letitia was nowhere to be found. Less than 72 hours after Paul Jandro disappeared, his wife, Letitia, had vanished as well. Police immediately launched a large-scale search operation. It had been 3 days since Paul, 50, had failed to appear for work in Norfolk. And now, Letitia Jandro, 37, was gone from their home in Moxville. But then, suddenly, on July 2, 2010, Letitia called 911. Her voice was calm, not panicked. She refused to disclose her location. But the strangest part? Tracking data showed that the call had been made from inside her own house. Immediately, police surrounded the home, preparing for a forced entry. Once they secured a search warrant, they moved in under the cover of night. As they entered the garage, something immediately caught their attention. A massive pile of trash sat in the middle of the space. They pushed further inside, guns drawn. The air was thick with an eerie silence. And then, finally, they found her. Letitia was lying motionless on the floor of a bedroom closet. For a moment, they thought she was dead. But no, she was still alive. Letitia was taken into custody as authorities began their long-awaited search of the house she had so desperately tried to keep them out of. During questioning, Letitia claimed she believed someone had tried to break into her home. She also denied knowing where Paul was one of the officers suddenly entered the interrogation room. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned down and whispered into his colleague's ear. In the garage, hidden beneath the foul-smelling pile of trash they had discovered earlier, investigators had just pulled out a 50-gallon plastic bin. The moment they opened it, an unbearable stench filled the air, the smell of decomposition. Inside, something was tightly wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and fabric. As the flashlight beam shone through, a lock of human hair peeked out from between the layers. It was a body. The investigators immediately contacted the medical examiner and the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation to confirm the victim's identity. Meanwhile, they returned to the interrogation room, where Leticia was still pretending to know nothing. The interrogator said, "I'm giving you one last chance to tell the truth, because we already know where Paul is." Her story began to change. At first, she continued to deny killing Paul. But then, she offered a new explanation. She claimed she knew who had done it. According to Leticia, it was drug dealers' men she had supposedly hired to teach Paul a lesson because she was angry with him. But why would a random group of drug dealers target Paul? Was Leticia telling the truth, or was this just another lie? As Leticia sat in the interrogation room, scrambling to come up with a convincing story, investigators continued searching her home. And then they found undeniable evidence. In a corner of the floor, something fell off. A section of carpet had been glued down with industrial adhesive. When they peeled it back, the sight underneath sent chills down everyone's spine. Blood everywhere. But that wasn't all. On the wooden floor beneath the carpet, they found multiple bullet holes, along with more bullet holes piercing the walls of the bedroom. Leticia had tried to cover them up using putty to fill each one. Police then inspected Leticia's car. Inside, they discovered a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. There was no more room for deception. When the medical examiner analyzed Paul's body, they confirmed that it was riddled with bullet wounds. The evidence was overwhelming. Leticia was immediately charged with murder. She was handcuffed and taken straight to the police station. But just when investigators thought the case was closed, Leticia suddenly made a shocking confession. A completely unexpected twist was about to unfold. On July 4, 2010, Leticia Jandro had been in custody for nearly 24 hours. Meanwhile, police were still piecing together the horrifying details of the murder. Paul's body had been discovered inside a 50-gallon plastic container, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, a desperate attempt to hide the truth. But the traces of the crime could not be erased. Even though Leticia kept insisting that she had only hired someone to teach Paul a lesson and that they had gone too far, investigators did not believe her story. The .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol found in Leticia's car was confirmed to be the murder weapon. When Paul's body was examined, the recovered bullets matched the caliber of the gun. But then came a shocking revelation. When police contacted Paul's family, they learned that Paul had been planning to file for divorce. In fact, he had given Leticia a deadline, June 30, to leave the house. And that was the very day he disappeared. Not long after, Leticia was booked into Currituck County Jail on murder charges. But in the end, she was the one who shattered all the lies. She reached out to investigators. She wanted to talk. And her final confession changed everything. "I shot Paul." Leticia claimed that everything started when Paul gave her an ultimatum to leave the house. "I met with a lawyer, and they told me I didn't have to go." But when she told Paul this, she claimed that he became more terrifying than ever. "He spent an entire month trying to scare me into leaving. Every morning, the moment I woke up, he would kick the door hard. I was terrified. And I was prepared to defend myself. Then came June 30, Paul's final deadline for Leticia to leave. According to Leticia, that morning, Paul stormed into the bedroom. But this time, he wasn't just kicking the door like before. This time, he was holding a rifle. He pointed it at me and said, "Get the hell out of my house right now," Leticia claimed. She said Paul gave her 5 minutes to leave
before turning his back and walking out.
But instead of running away, Letitia went to get her gun, and then she opened fire. I shot into the room and I hit him once. He staggered back and I shot him again. When he ran toward me, I kept shooting. He tried to grab the gun from me, but I just kept shooting.
The shooting only stopped when Paul collapsed. Afterward, Letitia panicked. She spent 3 days trying to hide his body, deny everything, and even fabricate a story about drug dealers teaching Paul a lesson. But the evidence police found told a different story. In September 2012, the trial of Letitia Jandro officially began. The prosecution completely rejected her claims of self-defense. Paul's death was not self-defense. We believe Letitia ambushed him. She did not want a divorce, and so she killed Paul out of her need for control.
Letitia's defense collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Bullet holes in the floor and bedroom walls proof that she fired repeatedly without hesitation. The .45 caliber handgun found in her car, which matched the bullets recovered from Paul's body. Her efforts to cover up the crime, cleaning up blood, wrapping the body in plastic, and lying to the police. The prosecutor emphasized Paul never had a chance to fight back. This was not self-defense. This was a deliberate murder. On September 28, 2012, the North Carolina courtroom was packed. Paul Jandro's family, friends, and colleagues were all there, holding their breath as they waited for the verdict. After months of legal battles, Letitia Jandro's fate now rested in the hands of the jury. Authorities believed they had an airtight case. Backed by overwhelming evidence, Paul's body was found inside Letitia's home, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and stuffed inside a 50-gallon tote. The bullet holes in the floor and walls suggested a premeditated murder. The .45 caliber gun recovered from Letitia's car matched the bullets in Paul's body. Letitia's shifting stories, first denying everything, then finally admitting she had shot her husband. The prosecution firmly rejected Letitia's self-defense claim, stating this was not self-defense. This was a cold, calculated murder. The jury took only 1 hour and 40 minutes to reach a verdict. What does that number say? A trial that lasted for months, yet the jury needed less than 2 hours to come to a unanimous decision. There was no doubt in their minds. And then the verdict was announced. Letitia Jandro, guilty of first-degree murder. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. On the surface, she looked like an ordinary suburban wife, working to support children with mental health issues. But beneath that appearance lay a shocking story full of secrets. Fred Andros, a man with a shady past, was involved in all sorts of illicit activities. Things started to spiral when one of Fred's colleagues was shot dead right after a choir rehearsal. The gunshots echoed through the night, leaving the remaining members in shock. The subsequent investigation uncovered a series of explosive secrets, bribery, illicit affairs, and underground dealings. This was no random attack. The victim was clearly targeted. The entire town couldn't believe what was happening, and the name Dawn Silvernail quickly became the center of all gossip. She was not as ordinary as people had thought. The whole case played out like a dramatic opera in the heart of America, where the darkest secrets were finally brought to light. Pleasant Valley, New York, October 28, 1999. The choir rehearsal at the United Methodist Church had just ended, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett left as usual. She crossed the street, got into a car, but just seconds later, a series of gunshots tore through the quiet night. At first, the other choir members didn't pay much attention to the sound. But then, someone noticed Susan slumped over the steering wheel, blood spreading all over her body. They rushed to help, frantically calling for emergency services. But amid the panic, a few had caught a glimpse of the shooters disappearing into the darkness. This was no random attack. Susan Fassett had been targeted. And as the police began their investigation, they quickly realized that this case was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind Susan's death was a web of corruption, dangerously intertwined relationships,
and dark sexual secrets no one had expected in such a quiet little town. Born in 1949, Dawn Mudge grew up along the Hudson River in Pleasant Valley, near the Catskill Mountains of New York. She was a true country girl, standing nearly 6 feet tall by the time she reached her teenage years.
Her life seemed relatively uneventful. 2 years at a community college, marriage at 21, followed by a few years at home raising her son. However, Dawn was not just an ordinary housewife.
She built her own career working for a non-profit organization.
Additionally, she was a passionate singer who frequently performed on the radio, delivering country western hits that had once topped the charts. On CB radio, she was known as Delta Dawn.
In 1977, at the age of 28, Delta Dawn began chatting over the radio with a mysterious man who called himself Neptune.
What seemed like a casual encounter turned out to be the beginning of an entirely new and unexpected chapter in her life.
Fred Andros was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, nothing like a god, but the nickname Neptune still fit him perfectly.
As the head of the water department, Fred held considerable power and did not hesitate to use it for personal gain. Rumors of bribery and corruption surrounding him were not uncommon. Although he was married, Fred was notorious for being a womanizer. He liked many different women. His charm did not come from his appearance, but from his power and his smooth way of talking.
At first, the relationship between Fred and Dawn seemed harmless. They simply talked over CB radio. Fred even brought his wife to listen to Dawn sing. They got to know each other and became friends. But then, the thin line between friendship and an affair quickly disappeared. Dawn did not love Fred.
To her, he was just a means to get what she wanted. Whenever she needed something, Fred was always ready to help, and that was what gave him a certain level of control over her. However, not every gift that Fred asked for was physical.
Sometimes it was just seemingly simple favors. By the way, can you take this outside for me, or can you drop this off at Joe Smith's house? The envelopes Dawn delivered seemed harmless, but in reality, they contained cash money obtained from the bribery and extortion schemes that Fred ran. When her first marriage ended in divorce, Dawn continued meeting Fred and carrying out his illegal errands for a decade.
Even after she remarried in 1992 to Ed Silvernail, a kind man, Dawn seemed unable to let go of the thrill of infidelity. But by this time, Fred's life was about to get much more interesting, far beyond secret meetings or envelopes stuffed with cash.
Things started to get serious in 1997, when a body was discovered floating in the Hudson River.
The dead man was an inspector, and immediately there were rumors that this was not a suicide.
The interesting thing was that it was Fred himself who helped spread those rumors.
He hinted that this death might have been a planned execution, suggesting that he had some connection to it.
Whether that was true or not remained a question, but these rumors caught the attention of the feds.
However, what the FBI was truly interested in was not the bribery network or the illegal activities within Fred's water department.
Those were just the surface. What they wanted was a bigger fish, a powerful figure whom Fred had ties to. And to get to this person, the FBI needed Fred to cooperate.
So, they began to put pressure on him.
By the spring of 1999, the feds had gathered enough evidence to force Fred to comply. He admitted to some close associates, "I need to tell you guys that I might get arrested."
But in reality, this was not a big shock to anyone who knew Fred.
Seeing that the situation was beyond saving, Fred quickly secured a deal that allowed him to avoid prison,
though the price was his career.
In May 1999, Fred resigned, and just a day later, he officially pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy. But the case didn't end there. Fred Andros's downfall was about to be overshadowed by an even more shocking scandal.
In Poughkeepsie, a case involving another town official, Susan Fassett, was about to explode.
Her death was not just a personal tragedy, it revealed the truth behind the seemingly peaceful facade of the town. The first clues in the investigation of Susan's death quickly hit dead ends.
The townspeople seemed determined to remain silent, hiding something. But then the police unexpectedly found another suspect along with a shocking secret and a truth that could change everything. Pleasant Valley, New York, October 28, 1999. Susan Fassett was shot dead in the parking lot just after leaving a choir rehearsal.
She had just sat in her car and fastened her seatbelt when a cold-blooded killer opened fire and fled.
Within minutes, police and emergency medical technicians, EMTs, arrived at the scene.
Susan was still breathing, and the EMTs did everything they could to keep her alive.
Meanwhile, investigators quickly followed a crucial lead. Some choir members had seen the suspect fleeing. They spotted a car speeding up the hill and even managed to record part of the license plate. After checking security cameras, the police found an alarming result. The car belonged to Jeff Fassett, Susan's husband. Suspicion immediately fell on Jeff.
He owned a gun, and more importantly, he was a police officer. Law enforcement quickly surrounded Jeff's house with extreme caution. When he realized the police were outside, Jeff remained calm, speaking on the phone and hinting that he was armed. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Susan Fassett was fighting for her life.
But then the SWAT team took action. They stormed the house and arrested Jeff Fassett while he was still armed.
Under heavy security and armed surveillance, the police escorted Jeff out of his home and took him straight to the nearest police barracks.
Jeff Fassett firmly denied any involvement in his wife's death. However, he revealed that a month earlier, he had discovered Susan was having an affair,
and her lover was none other than Fred Andros, the former water supervisor of Poughkeepsie,
a man infamous for corruption and secret affairs. The question now was, who killed Susan?
Was it Fred Andros, or was this just a diversion by Jeff to mislead the investigation?
Based on Jeff's demeanor in the interrogation room, investigators seemed to believe his story.
So they immediately sought out Fred Andros. It was nearly 3 a.m. BY then. When the police knocked on his door, Fred appeared genuinely distraught over Susan's death. He admitted that he and Susan had been involved for nearly 4 years, but insisted the affair had ended over a month ago, which matched Jeff's statement. When asked directly if he was involved in the murder, Fred denied it and even provided a solid alibi. At the time Susan was killed, he was having dinner at home with several friends, including a Poughkeepsie police officer. After 6 hours of polygraph testing, the results confirmed that Fred was telling the truth.
So what about the car seen fleeing the scene?
Upon further investigation, police realized it might have been a mistake due to misinterpreted information at the scene. This meant that both prime suspects, Jeff Fassett and Fred Andros, had motives to kill Susan, but neither seemed to have pulled the trigger.
After the medical examiner completed Susan's autopsy, the investigation suddenly took a new turn. Susan had been shot 6 times with a .45 caliber handgun. But more importantly, forensic tests revealed that she had engaged in sexual activity within 24 hours before her death. The question now was, who had she been with? Jeff, the husband she might have reconciled with? Or Fred Andros, the former lover? Clearly, the person who had been intimate with Susan right before she was murdered was not her husband. When questioned by police, Jeff Fassett stated that the last time they had been intimate was about 4 to 5 days prior. When detectives requested a DNA sample for testing, Jeff agreed without hesitation. But Fred Andros was different. When police asked for a DNA sample from Fred, he flatly refused, a suspicious move. Knowing that Fred would not cooperate willingly, the detectives decided to employ a more subtle tactic. They invited Fred to lunch, pretending to discuss the case further. Unsuspecting, Fred agreed. During the meal, the detectives discreetly collected a DNA sample from the straw Fred had used. The test results quickly confirmed the truth. The DNA found on Susan's body matched Fred's. This meant that Fred had lied. But why? If the two were still involved, why would Fred kill Susan? Or was her death completely unrelated to their affair?
With mounting evidence, Fred Andros was arrested.
But the true motive behind the murder remained a mystery. Did Susan hold a dark secret that threatened Fred, something that could jeopardize the plea deal he had signed with the federal government?
Or worse, was Susan more deeply involved in Fred's shady dealings than anyone had suspected?
On December 21, investigators brought Fred into the interrogation room.
As expected, federal agents immediately pressed him about corruption, specifically Susan's role in transporting money for Fred. They believed this had led to her death. At first, Fred tried to dodge the questions, stalling for time, but after hours of relentless pressure, his resistance began to crack.
The police intensified their push. Perhaps the rest of his life would be spent behind bars.
They warned that his previous plea deal could be revoked if he refused to cooperate. This was a devastating blow, making Fred realize he was running out of options. But then, investigators offered him a way out. "Tell us who killed Susan." And at that moment, Fred spoke.
He did what everyone had been waiting for. He named the killer. On December 21, 1999, nearly 2 months after Susan Fassett's murder, a grueling FBI interrogation cornered Fred Andros, the disgraced lover of Susan and former Poughkeepsie City official. Under pressure, Fred gave investigators a name he claimed was a crucial lead: Dawn Silvernail. Investigators immediately looked up Dawn's DMV records. When they saw her photo, one of them remarked, "She doesn't look like a murderer at all." But Fred had his own story. He claimed that Susan and Dawn were lovers, secretly involved in a lesbian relationship. This statement forced the police to dig deeper into their records. And then they uncovered 2 crucial details: the murder weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, and the getaway vehicle, a car that matched the description provided by a witness, registered under the name of Dawn's husband. The investigation team immediately set out, driving an hour to Dawn's house for questioning. When they arrived, Dawn was extremely cooperative. She even voluntarily handed over her gun to the police. Dawn admitted she knew Fred Andros. The two had been close friends and frequently communicated over CB radio during its heyday. But when the police mentioned Susan Fassett, her reaction was entirely different. Dawn insisted she had never met Susan. When investigators revealed that Fred had named her as the killer, Dawn's face showed pure shock.
He said, "What?"
Dawn Silvernail couldn't believe that her longtime friend would throw her under the bus like this. Considering Fred Andros's shady reputation, the fact that Dawn Silvernail was a married woman, and most importantly, that she had voluntarily turned over her gun, police leaned toward believing her. But when investigators sent the gun for forensic examination, they immediately noticed something suspicious. Someone had deliberately tampered with the barrel. This meant one of 2 things. Dawn was indeed the killer, or someone had borrowed and altered her gun to frame her. On December 28, when police summoned Dawn Silvernail for another interrogation and informed her that her gun's barrel had been tampered with, her demeanor immediately changed. She became more anxious, more concerned, and above all, more honest. Dawn admitted to having an affair with Fred Andros, but she insisted it was not love. It was a form of repayment.
The shocking truth began to unfold.
Fred not only had a relationship with Dawn, but also paid her to sleep with his friends.
Not all of Fred's friends were men.
In the summer of 1999, Fred made a new offer: "I want you to sleep with a woman I'm seeing, and I'll record it. I'll pay you $350 in cash." That woman was Susan Fassett. However, by the end of the summer, Susan wanted out. She wanted to go back to her husband, to leave Fred Andros and his twisted games behind. But Fred wouldn't allow it. Dawn admitted that she pulled the trigger, but not alone.
Fred was the true mastermind.
He didn't just blackmail her, he started making threats against her family. He showed Dawn a photo of her son leaving his shift at the factory, placed it in front of her, and coldly said, "You have to do this." And so Dawn did.
1 shot, then 5 more. Susan Fassett collapsed in the church parking lot, and Dawn Silvernail officially became a murderer.
Dawn's confession was more than enough for police to arrest her for murder. Her only hope was that she could tell her story in court and receive a lighter sentence. On December 29, police knocked on Fred's door, but no one answered. They didn't stop. A team of investigators entered the house, searching every corner. All signs indicated that Fred had been there. They went up to the attic, but Fred Andros had no intention of being arrested. He picked up a gun, pointed it at himself. The gunshot echoed. When police stormed in, they found only Fred's body on the floor, blood spreading across the room. Fred Andros had taken his own life. On January 29, 2001, at the Dutchess County Court in Poughkeepsie, the trial for the mastermind behind Susan Fassett's murder officially began. But the accused was not only Dawn Silvernail, the one who pulled the trigger, but also the man who orchestrated it from the shadows, Fred Andros. A year earlier, Fred had attempted suicide to escape justice, but fate was not on his side. He survived, his face left so disfigured by his injuries that he was barely recognizable. Today, he entered the courtroom to face justice. Dawn Silvernail was not present at the start of the trial. She was isolated, waiting for her turn to testify against Fred, whom she insisted was the real mastermind. She had agreed to a deal with prosecutors. Her life sentence was reduced to 18 years in exchange for her testimony. As the trial began, prosecutors laid out a sharp argument. Fred Andros had planned Susan Fassett's murder when she dared to leave him. He had manipulated everything. But Fred pleaded not guilty, shifting all the blame onto Dawn, painting a narrative that she was the mastermind, that she acted out of hatred. However, when Dawn took the witness stand, the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Her voice trembled, but every word cut through Fred's facade. "I'm sorry for killing that woman," she choked out, eyes filled with regret. Then she told everything. Fred had forced her to kill Susan. He had threatened her, manipulated her, and used her son as leverage to corner her into committing the crime. Before pulling the trigger, she had no intention of killing Susan. But when Susan stepped into the parking lot, casually opening her car door and fastening her seatbelt, Dawn had no choice. She raised the gun, finger tightening on the trigger. The gun fired once, then twice, then again, until it was empty. It all happened in seconds, but it changed her life forever. In a panic, she sped away, stopping at a payphone. She picked up the receiver, her hands still trembling from the horror she had just committed. "It's done," she said. Fred wasn't just behind the murder. He made sure the evidence disappeared. He drilled the gun barrel to prevent police from tracing the bullets, staged everything to pin the blame on Dawn. But his plan fell apart in that courtroom. With everything laid bare before the jury, Fred Andros had no escape. And finally he bowed his head and pleaded guilty. Fred Andros was tried for masterminding the murder of Susan Fassett in October 1999, and in the end, he was forced to bow his head and plead guilty. He admitted to orchestrating Susan's killing and even confessed to having been with her less than 24 hours before she was shot to death. With irrefutable evidence against him, the jury reached its final verdict. Fred Andros was guilty. But his fate was not in the hands of the court. It was in the hands of Dawn Silvernail, the woman who pulled the trigger, the woman he had manipulated into becoming a murderer. It was Dawn's testimony that put Fred behind bars, bringing an end to the days when he could so easily hide his crimes. Fred was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but fate did not grant him much time. Less than 2 years after his conviction, Fred Andros collapsed from a heart attack in prison, marking the end of a man who had once held power but was ultimately undone by his own sins. Following Fred's death, his daughter accepted the jury's verdict, making no attempts to defend or restore her father's name. As for Dawn Silvernail, the woman who had carried out the killing, she too paid a heavy price. Though her sentence was reduced due to a deal with the prosecution,
No punishment could weigh heavier than the memories she was forced to carry for the rest of her life.
Every night, every time she closed her eyes, she was forced to relive the moment she pulled the trigger, the sight of Susan collapsing, the echo of gunshots ringing in her mind, never able to escape the crime she had committed.
Lupita Acuna, a single mother of 5 children, had gone through 2 failed marriages.
When she met Jose, she thought she had finally found a pillar of support.
Jose not only brought warmth, but also helped her provide for her family. But there was one problem. Jose had a wife. This love triangle grew more and more intense, and when everything reached its breaking point, Jose was forced to make a decision, a fateful decision. The only problem was he never got the chance to make it. Jose was stabbed not just once, but 45 times.
Was it the betrayed wife, consumed by uncontrollable rage, or the desperate lover unable to accept being abandoned? The police had to uncover who had crossed the thin line between love and hatred.
And Lupita, she could never escape the haunting memory of that fateful night. Donna, Texas.
July 3, 2010, around 1 p.m.
A farmer working near Donna Lakes, a remote area on the outskirts of town, noticed a column of black smoke rising in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a small fire, nothing to worry about.
But as the flames continued to spread, he started to feel that something was off.
Donna Lakes is located near Tamaulipas, known as one of the biggest drug hubs in the region, where crime runs rampant. Feeling uneasy, the farmer immediately called 911.
Within minutes, the fire department arrived at the scene and discovered the source of the blaze, a Dodge Dakota pickup truck completely burned to ashes. But the truck wasn't the only thing that had been set on fire. Just a few steps away, a body lay face down on the ground, charred in the dying flames.
The horrific scene prompted the firefighters to immediately notify the police.
It didn't take long for them to realize that this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate murder, an attempt to cover up a crime.
In the victim's back pocket, a scorched wallet still held enough clues for identification.
The identity of the unfortunate man was quickly confirmed: Jose Guadalupe Fiscal.
But what was shocking was that the trail of the case didn't lead investigators to the dangerous drug cartels across the Rio Grande. Instead, it pulled them into a far more tangled story, a story of love, betrayal, and vengeance.
And it all began with Lupita Acuna, the woman who was ultimately connected to the man who was now dead.
Born in 1972 in South Texas, Lupita de Leon was a strong-willed woman with a tumultuous life. Her promiscuous nature led her through 2 failed marriages, leaving her alone to raise 5 children. By 2008, at the age of 36, Lupita was still a struggling single mother, working tirelessly to provide for her family.
But no matter how hard she tried, life with 5 children was never easy.
She refused to accept the fate of a lonely woman. Every weekend, Lupita would go to nightclubs, searching for a chance to start over.
And on a Saturday night in 2008, she found exactly what she was looking for: a man named Jose Fiscal. Jose was a charismatic man, courteous with women. He shared with Lupita that he had just ended his 17-year marriage.
Unlike Lupita, Jose was born in Mexico but had spent his childhood constantly migrating with his family between the 2 sides of the Rio Grande.
He spent his youth as an immigrant worker, laboring hard to build a career. Jose married Alma in 1993, and they had 4 children together. But while Jose's career flourished, his marriage gradually fell apart. By 2008, after 15 years of living together, Alma decided to separate and move to Louisiana to work at an oil refinery.
Despite their separation, Jose frequently visited to care for his children and spend time with Alma. After meeting Lupita, Jose seemed to find a replacement family. She and her 5 children filled the void in his life, bringing him the warmth he lacked. Their relationship developed quickly, but it didn't last long, because Jose went back to Alma.
But strangely, Lupita wasn't angry. She knew Jose would never be hers forever.
However, Even after Alma had settled in Louisiana, Jose and Lupita continued seeing each other,
going to nightclubs together as if nothing had changed.
Not long after Alma moved to Louisiana, Jose Fiscal decided to move in with Lupita de Leon. They built a new life together, but it was never truly complete.
Because despite settling into a new relationship, Jose was torn by an undeniable truth: he missed his children.
And they missed him. Jose's kids cherished every moment they had with their father, even if they felt uneasy about their surroundings and new family. 5 unfamiliar children of Lupita, and a house that never really felt like their own. As time passed, Jose no longer seemed like the man he once was.
After more than a year of living with Lupita, he became a different person, tense, anxious, as if he were trapped between 2 irreconcilable lives. The pressures on Jose grew heavier, and then investigators discovered a grand plan he had been harboring. But there were 2 entirely different stories about his death, 2 conflicting explanations that left police unsure of what to believe. Was it a drug-related murder, or a family dispute that went too far? On July 3, 2010, the Hidalgo County Police received an emergency call about a strange fire on the outskirts of Donna, Texas. A farmer had reported the incident around 1:00 p.m., and when firefighters arrived at the scene, they uncovered a horrifying sight: a pickup truck completely burned to ashes,
with smoke still rising thickly. But the worst part was just a few steps away. A body lay face down on the ground, burned beyond recognition. After extinguishing the fire, investigators identified the victim, 37-year-old Jose Fiscal. In his pocket, his wallet remained, suggesting that Jose may have been killed at the scene before being set on fire. But the most horrifying detail was how he was murdered. Jose wasn't just killed, he was tortured to death. His body was covered in stab wounds from his neck, back, and buttocks to his legs.
The killer didn't just want Jose dead. They seemed to be sending a message of pure hatred.
Afterward, his body and truck were doused in accelerant and burned to nothing. But the biggest question remained: who wanted Jose Fiscal dead in such a brutal manner?
Police considered several theories. This could have been a revenge killing related to drugs, as the area had strong ties to cross-border cartels.
Or perhaps it was a personal conflict that spiraled out of control.
The first clues emerged when the farmer who called the police claimed to have seen an SUV leaving the scene just before the fire erupted. As law enforcement raced to track down the mysterious SUV, investigators turned to Jose's family to learn about his life before the murder. The first person they contacted was Jaime Fiscal, the victim's brother.
When police interrogated Jaime Fiscal, Jose's brother, they hoped for some clue as to who might have wanted him dead.
Jaime insisted he had no idea who had a motive to kill Jose, but he did reveal a conflicting truth: Jose had both a wife and a girlfriend.
Immediately the question arose: had this love triangle ignited a murder fueled by hatred? Jaime explained that although Jose and his wife, Alma, were separated, she still frequently brought their children from Louisiana to visit their father. Each time, Alma would spend the weekend with the kids and then return home. Meanwhile, Jose's girlfriend, Lupita Acuna, lived just a few miles from Donna Lakes.
When police arrived at Lupita's house to inform her of Jose's death, she was completely devastated.
But notably, Lupita was very cooperative, willingly going to the police station to assist with the investigation.
However, what Lupita said seemed to shift suspicion toward Alma. She claimed that Jose had been trying to cut ties with Alma to start a new life with her.
But on the morning of the murder, Jose had received a series of mysterious phone calls that left him visibly anxious.
Lupita believed the caller could have been a drug dealer that Jose had once worked with.
This raised a new question. Was Jose a victim of the raging drug war along the border? Or was this simply a family dispute that escalated too far?
Investigators continued following Jose's trail and made a shocking discovery: he had recently purchased a house in the nearby town of West Laco. But it wasn't for Lupita. He had bought it for his estranged wife, Alma. After discovering that Alma had returned to Texas, investigators immediately drove to West Laco to speak with her.
When they knocked on her door and broke the news of Jose's death, Alma was completely distraught. But the crucial detail was that her statement completely contradicted Lupita's.
According to Alma, she and Jose had reconciled, which was why he had bought the house in West Laco not for Lupita,
but for her and their children. But what was even more shocking was what had happened 2 days before the murder.
On July honest, Alma and the kids returned to Texas from Louisiana and were completely stunned to find Lupita at Jose's house. Alma recalled, "I asked Jose, what is she doing here?" Jose admitted that he had allowed Lupita and her kids to stay there, but in the end, he had chosen Alma. He asked Lupita to leave, and although she quietly packed her things, Alma insisted that as she walked out the door, Lupita's face showed nothing but pain and deep resentment. But that wasn't all. Lupita had told police that on the morning of Jose's murder, he had received constant calls from a mysterious drug dealer.
But according to Alma, that wasn't true.
There was no drug dealer. It was Lupita who kept calling Jose. Alma stated that Lupita had sent countless messages and called repeatedly to the point that Jose eventually turned off his phone to get some rest.
She also claimed that the night before the murder, Jose had barely slept, looking tense and uneasy. The next morning, before leaving the house, Jose tried to reassure Alma, telling her he was just going out to run a few errands. But just a few hours later, he was found stabbed to death next to his burning truck. It was clear that one of these two women was lying. The next day, after interrogating Alma, investigators decided to follow Lupita to her mother's house.
But as soon as they arrived, a light brown Ford Expedition suddenly left the scene. This vehicle matched a witness's description of the car seen leaving the crime scene. While searching the surrounding area, investigators discovered another brown Ford Expedition, also registered under Lupita's name.
What was even more suspicious was that the SUV had been recently cleaned, both inside and out,
as if someone was trying to hide something.
Not stopping there, investigators took another approach. They decided to check Lupita's phone records. What they found perfectly aligned with Alma's testimony.
Right after Jose told her to leave his house, Lupita desperately began texting and calling him nonstop. Around midnight on July 20, she begged Jose to meet her, but he did not respond.
She did not give up. Lupita stayed up all night, continuously sending messages. On the morning of July 3rd, just hours before Jose was murdered, he finally responded.
At around 11 a.m., he agreed to meet Lupita at his store. Just 2 hours later, Jose was found dead.
Jose was not the only person Lupita was texting in the 36 hours leading up to the murder. Her phone records revealed a shocking truth. Lupita had been in constant contact with her 19-year-old son, Antonio de Leon, and her brother-in-law, Juan Salazar. Even more disturbingly, she sent Juan a horrifying message, "I want to kill Jose." Just minutes later, Antonio replied with a message suggesting he was looking for a weapon. On the very day of the murder, just an hour before Jose's body was discovered, Lupita sent Juan one final message, a message that seemed to place her at the crime scene.
On the afternoon of July 6th, investigators decided to take action. They arrived at Lupita's house and arrested all 4 individuals: Lupita, her brother-in-law, Juan Salazar, her son, Antonio de Leon, and Antonio's girlfriend, Renee. The interrogations began.
When questioned, Renee denied any involvement in the murder, but she revealed a shocking detail. On the morning of the murder at around 11 a.m., she saw Juan Salazar say to Antonio, "Hey, it's time to go." They left the house in Lupita's brown SUV.
A few hours later, at around 1 p.m., they returned with their clothes covered in blood.
Horrified, Renee asked what had happened, but Lupita simply ordered, "Stay out of this and get out of here now."
Lupita then instructed Antonio and Juan to clean the SUV immediately.
Renee's testimony became strong evidence against Lupita. But investigators did not stop there. They continued interrogating Antonio. When Antonio entered the interrogation room and heard what his girlfriend had just revealed, it was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. His breathing became rapid. He leaned forward and sighed, then finally said what the investigators had been waiting for. He regretted what he had done.
Antonio confessed that he, his mother Lupita, and his uncle Juan had killed Jose.
According to Antonio, Jose had no suspicion whatsoever.
When they suddenly attacked him, he was in complete shock, unable to believe what was happening.
Unlike Antonio, Juan, who had a prior criminal record, remained silent and refused to say anything.
Meanwhile, Lupita agreed to an interview. She admitted that she had previously lied about the incident.
According to her, she and Jose had only gone to Donna Lakes to talk, with no intention of killing him.
However, she claimed that Antonio and Juan unexpectedly showed up and suddenly attacked Jose. Lupita insisted that she was completely shocked and had no prior knowledge of the murder plan.
However, investigators did not believe her story. In the end, Hidalgo County Police arrested Lupita, her son, Antonio, and her brother-in-law, Juan Salazar, for murder.
On April 12, 2011, at the District Court in Edinburgh, Texas, Lupita Acuna stood trial for murder alongside her eldest son,
Antonio de Leon, and her brother-in-law, Juan Salazar.
Antonio had confessed to the crime, while Juan remained silent and pleaded not guilty. However, that did not help Juan, as a month before Lupita's trial, the jury had already found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison.
When Lupita's trial took place that Tuesday, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to secure a conviction. In their opening statements, they emphasized that Lupita was obsessed with Jose and filled with hatred. Prosecutors presented a series of angry messages that Lupita had sent to Jose, as well as messages she had sent to her son, clear evidence that she had planned and orchestrated the murder. The highlight of the trial was Antonio's confession. Although he refused to testify against his mother, he had signed a written confession. When it was read aloud in court, the details inside exposed the horrifying truth behind Lupita's murder plot. Faced with undeniable evidence, Lupita could not deny her crime. Shortly after, the jury reached a verdict. Lupita was guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison.
As for Antonio, for following his mother's orders, he received a 15-year prison sentence for murder.
Under the blazing fire in the dead of night, Melissa and Gary Cole's home was reduced to ashes.
As firefighters rushed to the scene, they weren't just battling fierce flames, they were facing a chilling mystery. Was this a tragic accident or a crime concealed beneath the fire's fury? For 11 years, Gary had promised Melissa a better life, a refuge from the wounds of her past. But was their marriage truly a safe harbor, or were there cracks beneath the surface, waiting to shatter?
As the embers cooled, only one question remained. What really ignited the destruction, a faulty heater or a deadly secret? Under the silent night sky of McNairy County, Tennessee, on November 3, 2009, a 911 call pierced the calm at 1:00 a.m.,
shattering the peace of the neighborhood.
A panicked neighbor reported a fire at the home of Gary and Melissa Cole. "We woke up to the smell of smoke," the caller said.
"My husband stepped out onto the back porch
and saw their house engulfed in flames." Firefighters raced to the scene, red lights flashing against the billowing smoke. Onlookers held their breath, fearing for the lives of Melissa, Gary, and their 9-year-old son.
If they were still inside, their chances of survival were grim.
When the flames finally died down, all that remained of the house was a charred ruin. As firefighters sifted through the smoldering wreckage, they made a grim discovery, a burned body on what was left of the living room couch. It was a man. But if that was Gary Cole, where was Melissa?
And had their 9-year-old son vanished with the fire? Melissa Broadwater, known as Missy to her family, grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a childhood marred by trauma.
From an early age, she endured abuse at the hands of her father. After her parents' divorce, she and her mother moved to Nashville, seeking a fresh start.
But that hope was short-lived when her mother, Kay, remarried a man just as cruel. That marriage also ended in violence, leaving Melissa with deep emotional scars.
These wounds shaped her into a rebellious teenager. At 17, she met James Bear, a 24-year-old electrician.
Despite her mother's disapproval, she ran away with James and married him in 1987.
When she became pregnant with their first child, Melissa felt happier than ever. Their daughter was born in 1988, followed by a son 3 years later. For over a decade, Melissa devoted herself to being a full-time mother. By 1998, she decided to return to work and took a part-time job at the electrical company where James worked. But working together didn't bring them closer. James was nearing 40 while Melissa had just turned 30. They drifted apart, their love fading. Melissa felt neglected, isolated in her own marriage. Then a co-worker took notice of her, Gary Cole. Unlike James, Gary was carefree, funny, and had a way of making Melissa feel special.
What started as harmless jokes soon spiraled into a full-blown affair. Things became even more complicated when Melissa discovered she was pregnant with Gary's child. And this was only the beginning of a tragedy no one could have predicted. What shocked everyone the most wasn't Melissa's affair, it was the decision she made afterward. Instead of leaving Gary to return to her family, she chose to walk away from everything. Melissa's family was stunned when they learned that the once devoted mother had abandoned her 2 children, an 8-year-old boy and an 11-year-old girl, to pursue a new life with another man. Shortly after giving birth to Gary's child in 1999, Melissa cut off all contact with everyone, including James and her children. She and Gary moved to rural McNairy County, starting a new chapter. But just months after their son was born, in the spring of 2000, Gary began to change. His family noticed the difference. He was no longer the carefree, light-hearted man he used to be. As he reached his 40s, he struggled with the physically demanding nature of construction work. Financial pressure weighed heavily on the couple, and the marriage they had once dreamed of was no longer a fairy tale. After years of silence, Melissa unexpectedly reached out to her family. When she returned to Nashville with her youngest son, she was a completely different person. Her mother was shocked by the change. Missy, once bold and impulsive, was now timid and guarded, as if she were constantly afraid of something. Her eyes were empty, and whenever someone asked what had happened, she would evade the question with a simple, "I'm fine." No one knew exactly what had changed Melissa. Back at the burned house, as the sheriff's department began searching for her and her son, a terrifying truth started to emerge. They didn't know if the mother and child had been kidnapped or if they had fled. But as firefighters examined the ashes, they noticed something strange. The kitchen knives hadn't burned in the usual pattern. Instead of being scorched upward, they had burned downward, an unusual sign that suggested the fire hadn't started naturally. And if the fire wasn't an accident, what had really happened to Melissa Cole? McNairy County, Tennessee, November 3, 2009, around 1:30 a.m. The blaring red lights of fire trucks sliced through the darkness as firefighters rushed to the scene. Melissa and Gary Cole's house was engulfed in flames, the inferno raging too fiercely for any hope of survival. As the fire was finally brought under control, the firefighters began searching through the wreckage. A small crowd of friends and family gathered outside, anxiously waiting for news. Then, a devastating discovery: a charred body, seemingly that of an adult male, possibly Gary Cole. But Melissa and her son were nowhere to be found. People desperately tried calling Melissa's phone, but there was no answer. Meanwhile, authorities carefully collected what remained of the body, placing it in a black bag and sending it off for forensic examination. The remains were so badly burned that identification was nearly impossible. But the biggest question now was,
Where were Melissa and her son? Once the body was removed, the scene was turned over to the arson investigation team from the McNairy County Fire Marshal's office. Their job was difficult, dangerous, and time-consuming. A trained arson detection dog was also brought in to assist, but before the investigation could even begin, one of the experts noticed something crucial. With their experienced eye, they spotted an anomaly in the kitchen. The burn patterns didn't rise as they normally would. Instead, the fire had spread downward onto the floor, suggesting that a flammable liquid had been poured before the fire was set. Whether it was kerosene, gasoline, or some other accelerant, one thing was certain: this fire was no accident. The flames had started in the kitchen, but who had set them? And more importantly, where were Melissa and her son? While the arson investigation team continued working at the scene, the family was desperately trying to contact Melissa. Every call went unanswered until a few hours later, when Gary's brother checked his voicemail and discovered a message from her. "Has anyone seen Gary?" Melissa's voice in the message showed no sign that she was aware of what had happened. She didn't mention the fire, nor did she sound panicked or distraught. It was as if she had no idea about the tragedy that had occurred. Gary's brother immediately called her back, and this time Melissa answered. When he told her that their house had burned down and that Gary had died in the fire, she seemed shocked. He urged her to contact the sheriff immediately. That afternoon, Melissa arrived at the investigation office. Just hours after being informed that her husband had died in a devastating fire, she appeared dazed, but something seemed off. She told the police that Gary wasn't even supposed to be home at the time. According to Melissa, her husband had left town for a job interview in Memphis and had told her he would be gone for 2 to 3 days. She also explained that she had taken their son to Nashville to visit family, which was where she was when she received the call from Gary's brother. But if Gary was in Memphis, how could he have died in a fire at their home? When investigators spoke with Gary's family, they were equally confused. Melissa insisted. "Gary never goes anywhere without telling me first, and he certainly wouldn't leave town without informing his mother." So, had Gary actually left, or was he hiding something? And if he wasn't the one who started the fire, then who did? At the West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center, the autopsy results confirmed that the body recovered from the ashes was indeed Gary Cole. But what shocked investigators even more was the cause of death. Gary had not died in the fire. He had been shot. A single 9mm bullet was found lodged in the back of his head, a fatal execution-style shot. Police quickly ruled out the possibility of suicide. Someone had stood behind Gary and pulled the trigger. By the afternoon of November 4, more than 24 hours after the devastating fire, dental records finally confirmed the victim's identity. But now, this case was no longer just about a tragic house fire. It was murder. The fire had destroyed nearly the entire crime scene, making it difficult for investigators to find clues. But one thing was clear: Melissa and her son were not present when the fire broke out. This immediately put them at the top of the list of people to investigate. Gary's family told police that the couple had been struggling financially. Their debts had been piling up for the past 3 years, and the situation had only gotten worse. However, one surprising detail made investigators hesitate to suspect Melissa. If Melissa truly wanted to be free of Gary, she didn't need to kill him. On August 10, just 3 months before the murder, Gary had filed for divorce. If Melissa wanted out of the marriage, all she had to do was wait. So why was Gary murdered? And more importantly, who pulled the trigger? Just like when she left her first husband, Melissa seemed ready to walk away from her son with Gary. She did not fight for custody. In fact, she agreed to give Gary full parental rights. What was even more unusual was how peaceful their separation appeared to be. Melissa continued living in the house, sleeping in the back bedroom, while the divorce process was being finalized. But then something changed. Melissa began regretting giving up custody. That's when McNairy County authorities started asking more questions, especially about the timing of the divorce. November 5. The McNairy County Sheriff summoned Melissa for further questioning, this time asking her to bring her son with her. At the station, investigators separated the two, placing them in separate interrogation rooms.
While Melissa waited, detectives focused on questioning her 9-year-old son. And then something unexpected happened. His story was completely different from his mother's. Contrary to what Melissa had told police, her son confirmed that his father was home that night.
He also clearly remembered the night before the fire. On Sunday night, I was sleeping when I suddenly heard a loud bang.
I woke up and ran out to see what had happened. Mom was standing there. I asked her what the noise was. She said she was wrapping Christmas presents and had accidentally dropped something.
The police immediately knew this was a lie. Then, the boy continued, after that, I went back to bed. When I woke up the next morning, I saw Dad lying on the couch, completely covered by a blanket.
I asked Mom what was wrong with him, and she said he was sick and told me not to touch him.
Then she took me out for the whole day shopping.
Mom told me to stay in the car while she bought things like a mop and cleaning supplies.
The boy did not fully understand what had happened.
But based on his story, investigators formed a terrifying theory. Melissa may have tried to clean up the crime scene, but her 9-year-old son had been there the entire time.
After completing the interrogation with the son, the investigators entered Melissa's interrogation room. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. It was no longer a casual conversation like 2 days before they directly confronted Melissa with her son's testimony. Faced with mounting evidence, Melissa quickly broke down. With no way out, she was forced to confess the truth. According to Melissa's confession, on the morning of November 2, she and Gary had an argument while their son was still asleep. Initially, it was not a major fight, but the situation quickly escalated to a dangerous level. In a fit of rage, Gary stormed into the bedroom and then returned with a gun. Melissa claimed that Gary forced her to sit down in the living room, placed the gun on his lap, and threatened her. According to her, Gary suspected that she was reconsidering their custody agreement and planning to take their son away. After a tense standoff, Gary decided to put the gun back in the bedroom and returned to the sofa in the living room. Eventually, he fell asleep. At that moment, Melissa made a fateful decision. She believed she was in danger, that she knew exactly what kind of person Gary was, and that she needed to protect herself. She walked into the bedroom, took Gary's gun, and then returned to the living room. As Gary slept soundly on the sofa, Melissa raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Gary Cole died instantly. Although she admitted to shooting her husband, Melissa denied setting the house on fire. She said, "I didn't set the fire."
I don't think so. This vague statement raised suspicions among investigators.
She neither fully denied her involvement in the arson, nor took responsibility for it. However, the fact that Melissa had killed her husband was undeniable.
As soon as the interrogation ended, the sheriff's deputies entered the room and arrested Melissa on charges of murder.
The trial begins. Nearly a year after Gary Cole's body was discovered in the smoldering remains of their home,
42-year-old Melissa Cole walked into the courtroom to face charges of murdering her husband.
According to the prosecution, this was neither an accident nor an act of self-defense. They argued that Melissa had planned the murder to secure custody of her son, with their divorce set to be finalized in just 1 week. That fateful night, instead of allowing the legal system to determine the outcome, she picked up a gun, aimed it at the back of Gary's head, and pulled the trigger. Prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder and opened the trial with testimony from fire investigators
who uncovered multiple signs that the house had been deliberately set ablaze to cover up the crime.
However, the most crucial witness was none other than their 10-year-old son, who recounted the mysterious noises that night and his mother's strange behavior afterward.
In contrast to the prosecution's accusations, Melissa did not deny shooting Gary, but she insisted it was an act of self-defense.
She testified that for years, Gary had physically, emotionally, and sexually abused her, controlling every aspect of her life. On the morning of November 2, 2009, she claimed that Gary threatened her with a gun, forcing her to act first to protect herself. But one critical question remained. If she was truly an abused wife, why not wait just one more week for the divorce instead of killing her husband? Was it desperation or a calculated plan? Was she a victim or a murderer? The answer would be decided in the courtroom.
October 7, 2010, the verdict inside a McNairy County courtroom in Tennessee. Melissa Cole sat in silence, awaiting her fate. The 42-year-old woman stood accused of shooting Gary Cole in the head, then setting their house on fire to conceal the crime.
Throughout the trial, Melissa never denied pulling the trigger but maintained that she had done so as a battered woman fighting for her life. However, the jury remained unconvinced. In their final verdict, they found her guilty of murder, though not first-degree murder as originally charged. Instead, they convicted her of second-degree murder, acknowledging the killing was intentional but lacked the premeditation required for a first-degree charge. Additionally, the jury found her guilty of arson and evidence tampering. In the end, the judge sentenced Melissa to 25 years in prison, 21 years for second-degree murder, 4 years for arson. As the sentence was read aloud, Gary Cole's family breathed a sigh of relief, believing justice had finally been served.
But for Melissa, was this truly punishment or just the next chapter in the tragedy of her life? I can't generate an image right now, but could you describe the scene in more detail? For example, the surroundings, the girl's emotions, or the dominant colors in the picture. This will help me prepare a better description when I can create images again. The trial of Ana Trujillo. With all the evidence against her, investigators officially charged Ana Trujillo with murder. On March 31, 2014, she walked into a packed courtroom in Houston's Harris County Courthouse. The case had become a media sensation. Headlines labeled her as a 45-year-old massage therapist accused of brutally murdering her 59-year-old scientist boyfriend.
The public was captivated by the shocking details. During the trial, both sides fought fiercely to prove their case. The defense argued that Ana acted in self-defense, that Stefan had attacked her, and she did what she had to do to survive. The prosecution, however, completely disagreed. They painted Ana as a violent and aggressive woman who had mercilessly beaten her partner to death.
In the courtroom, prosecutors made their final plea. Ana Trujillo savagely murdered her lover.
Nothing stopped her from doing it. Nothing will stop her from doing it again.
She deserves a life sentence. Put her away forever. Then came the moment of truth.
Ana waited anxiously as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was announced. Guilty.
The verdict: a life sentence. Ana Trujillo was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that she had intentionally killed Stefan Anderson.
But the most shocking moment came after the verdict. Instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Ana stood up defiantly and declared, "I do not regret what I did." She showed no fear, no remorse, no concern, only cold defiance. The judge and jury had seen enough. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for
the trial of Ana Trujillo. With all the evidence against her, investigators officially charged Ana Trujillo with murder. On March 31, 2014, she walked into a packed courtroom in Houston's Harris County Courthouse. The case had become a media sensation. Headlines labeled her as a 45-year-old massage therapist accused of brutally murdering her 59-year-old scientist boyfriend.
The public was captivated by the shocking details. During the trial, both sides fought fiercely to prove their case. The defense argued that Ana acted in self-defense, that Stefan had attacked her, and she did what she had to do to survive. The prosecution, however, completely disagreed. They painted Ana as a violent and aggressive woman who had mercilessly beaten her partner to death.
In the courtroom, prosecutors made their final plea. Ana Trujillo savagely murdered her lover.
Nothing stopped her from doing it. Nothing will stop her from doing it again.
She deserves a life sentence. Put her away forever. Then came the moment of truth.
Ana waited anxiously as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was announced. Guilty.
The verdict: a life sentence. Ana Trujillo was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that she had intentionally killed Stefan Anderson.
But the most shocking moment came after the verdict. Instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Ana stood up defiantly and declared, "I do not regret what I did." She showed no fear, no remorse, no concern, only cold defiance. The judge and jury had seen enough. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Stefan Anderson.
Her weapon of choice? A 5.5-inch high, heeled shoe, a murder so shocking that it left an entire city in disbelief. Bananoy, type tok chat GPT, tuanoy. That was the final part of the story. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stefan Anderson. After the trial, the case continued to attract public attention due to its bizarre nature, a high-heeled shoe used as a deadly weapon. Many people debated whether Ana had truly acted in self-defense or if she was a cold-blooded killer.
Despite her conviction,
The trial of Ana Trujillo, with all the evidence against her, investigators officially charged Ana Trujillo with murder. On March 31, 2014, she walked into a packed courtroom in Houston's Harris County Courthouse. The case had become a media sensation. Headlines labeled her as a 45-year-old massage therapist accused of brutally murdering her 59-year-old scientist boyfriend.
the public was captivated by the shocking details. During the trial, both sides fought fiercely to prove their case. The defense argued that Ana acted in self-defense, that Stefan had attacked her, and she did what she had to do to survive. The prosecution, however, completely disagreed. They painted Ana as a violent and aggressive woman who had mercilessly beaten her partner to death.
In the courtroom, prosecutors made their final plea. Ana Trujillo savagely murdered her lover.
Nothing stopped her from doing it. Nothing will stop her from doing it again.
She deserves a life sentence. Put her away forever. Then came the moment of truth.
Ana waited anxiously as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was announced. Guilty.
The verdict: a life sentence. Ana Trujillo was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that she had intentionally killed Stefan Anderson.
But the most shocking moment came after the verdict. Instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Ana stood up defiantly and declared, "I do not regret what I did." She showed no fear, no remorse, no concern, only cold defiance. The judge and jury had seen enough. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Stefan Anderson.
Her weapon of choice? A 5.5-inch high, heeled shoe, a murder so shocking that it left an entire city in disbelief. Bananoy, type tok chat GPT, tuanoy. That was the final part of the story. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stefan Anderson. After the trial, the case continued to attract public attention due to its bizarre nature, a high-heeled shoe used as a deadly weapon. Many people debated whether Ana had truly acted in self-defense or if she was a cold-blooded killer.
Despite
The trial of Ana Trujillo, with all the evidence against her, investigators officially charged Ana Trujillo with murder. On March 31, 2014, she walked into a packed courtroom in Houston's Harris County Courthouse. The case had become a media sensation. Headlines labeled her as a 45-year-old massage therapist accused of brutally murdering her 59-year-old scientist boyfriend.
the public was captivated by the shocking details. During the trial, both sides fought fiercely to prove their case. The defense argued that Ana acted in self-defense, that Stefan had attacked her, and she did what she had to do to survive. The prosecution, however, completely disagreed. They painted Ana as a violent and aggressive woman who had mercilessly beaten her partner to death.
In the courtroom, prosecutors made their final plea. Ana Trujillo savagely murdered her lover.
Nothing stopped her from doing it. Nothing will stop her from doing it again.
She deserves a life sentence. put her away forever. Then came the moment of truth.
Anna waited anxiously as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was announced. Guilty.
The verdict: a life sentence. Ana Trujillo was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that she had intentionally killed Stefan Andersson.
But the most shocking moment came after the verdict. Instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Anna stood up defiantly and declared, "I do not regret what I did." She showed no fear, no remorse, no concern, only cold defiance. The judge and jury had seen enough. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Stefan Andersson.
Her weapon of choice? A 5.5-inch high, heeled shoe, a murder so shocking that it left an entire city in disbelief. Bananoy, type tok chat GPT tuanoy. That was the final part of the story. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stefan Andersson. After the trial, the case continued to attract public attention due to its bizarre nature, a high-heeled shoe used as a deadly weapon. Many people debated whether Anna had truly acted in self-defense or if she was a cold-blooded killer. The trial of Ana Trujillo, with all the evidence against her, investigators officially charged Ana Trujillo with murder. On March 31, 2014, she walked into a packed courtroom in Houston's Harris County Courthouse. The case had become a media sensation. Headlines labeled her as a 45-year-old massage therapist accused of brutally murdering her 59-year-old scientist boyfriend.
The public was captivated by the shocking details. During the trial, both sides fought fiercely to prove their case. The defense argued that Anna acted in self-defense, that Stefan had attacked her, and she did what she had to do to survive. The prosecution, however, completely disagreed. They painted Anna as a violent and aggressive woman who had mercilessly beaten her partner to death.
In the courtroom, prosecutors made their final plea. Ana Trujillo savagely murdered her lover.
Nothing stopped her from doing it. Nothing will stop her from doing it again.
She deserves a life sentence. Put her away forever. Then came the moment of truth.
Anna waited anxiously as the jury deliberated. Finally, the verdict was announced. Guilty.
The verdict: a life sentence. Ana Trujillo was found guilty of murder. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, concluding that she had intentionally killed Stefan Andersson.
But the most shocking moment came after the verdict. Instead of breaking down or showing remorse, Anna stood up defiantly and declared, "I do not regret what I did." She showed no fear, no remorse, no concern, only cold defiance. The judge and jury had seen enough. Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Stefan Andersson.
Her weapon of choice? A 5.5-inch high, heeled shoe, a murder so shocking that it left an entire city in disbelief. Final part of the story: Ana Trujillo was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stefan Andersson. After the trial, the case continued to attract public attention due to its bizarre nature, a high-heeled shoe used as a deadly weapon. Many people debated whether Anna had truly acted in self-defense or if she was a cold-blooded killer.